We have all allowed a particular part of our brain, what we call at my organization, Moral Courage College, the ego brain, to determine what reality is. And so if I am so intent on having clarity that all I see you as is a brown guy, then again, factually, you may indeed be that. But there's so much more to you than that. And so the clarity I think I have is actually nonsense.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of The Hopeful Majority. Now, look, it doesn't take a tactical genius to tell you that there's a lot happening on college campuses across the country. We're seeing things happening in Columbia University. We're seeing things happening in workplaces. There's a lot of discord, especially as it relates to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And obviously, we see a lot of challenge as it relates to the way that people are engaging our politics, engaging our discourse, and folks are looking for avenues and opportunities to have really productive conversations. How do we bring a level of respectful, productive, highly contentious engagement when it seems like it's absolutely impossible to have a conversation? And today I could think of no one better than to talk with Irshad Manji. She'll be our guest. An amazing conversation. We touch on everything from DEI to how to have productive conversations to the personal stories of Irshad and how Irshad as a scholar, academic, practitioner has come to the place where she is today. Someone that started as a conflict entrepreneur, went through a transformation over a decade, and is now advocating for productive dialogue and conversation. This is a conversation worth listening to. I don't want to do a monologue here because I think that you'll find this conversation deeply productive. This is one of those that you'll want to listen in its entirety because I learned a lot from what respect actually means to the distinction between hope and optimism to why it's so difficult at this moment to have productive conversations to the fact that oftentimes when you talk about bridging differences, people just think it's some hokey pokey hold hands, but no, that couldn't be further from the truth. Welcome, Irshad, to the Hopeful Majority.
I may not be a majority in anybody's world, but I remain hopeful. So thank you
You're right.
for the
Well, I
invite.
was I was I was just telling you in the pre-prep, like, and I don't even think it's a real prep, but it's like who would be the who would be the top 5 people on my list to just have a conversation with, just to like understand what you're up to, what you're doing, and to get a perspective on how to think about the world with, what happened on October 7th, the turmoil on college campuses. You and I are recording this right now with what's happening in Colombia with the sit-in. We've got I don't know if you saw this, but Google had their employees protesting about their investments and businesses as it relates to Israel. I was like, it would be foolish to not talk to someone like you.
Well, my responses may be foolish, but I appreciate your your faith in me. So let's get right into it.
So the reason why I thought it would be useful to have this conversation is because I think I really view you as a younger person, both as someone that's like been inspirational in terms of how you think about the world, but also because your most recent book, Don't Label Me, has a subtitle that says essentially, how do we have diversity without inflaming culture wars? And that statement seems especially relevant right now.
Right.
How do we have diversity on places like college campuses without inflaming the culture wars?
Okay, so softball right there, not. Um, so first things first, how are we defining diversity?
Right.
It's just so reductionist to imagine diversity as only about being demographic. Brown, white, black, male, female, non-binary, Christian, Muslim, Jew, differently abled, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things matter. They matter. And we know that within groups, there is diversity too. For example, I happen to be Muslim. Does that mean I think like every other Muslim out there? If you know my backstory, you know, hell no.
Mhm. Mhm.
So, uh, we get in trouble when we assume that groups based on visible identity markers are monolithic. They're not. And that's why diversity of thought, diversity of perspective, and even diversity of interpretation has got to be part and parcel of diversity itself. And it's when we forget that piece that somehow many of us feel betrayed by those who don't live up to our, let's be honest, stereotype of what they're supposed to be based on the labels that we've given to them or that they have taken for themselves.
So I'm taken back to my 5th grade class where my teacher would always say, "Manu, don't focus on people's stereotypes, focus on their content of the character." You know, the classic things that we were brought up in, we were
Right.
thinking about. But for some reason what you just said might appear controversial at this moment. Why is that?
I hope that you can help explain it to me, actually, Manu, because here's what I'm coming to appreciate. Um, we have all allowed a particular part of our brain, what we call at my organization, Moral Courage College, the ego brain, to determine what reality is. And so if I am so intent on having clarity that all I see you as is a brown guy, then again, factually, you may indeed be that. But there's so much more to you than that. And so the clarity I think I have is actually nonsense.
Hmm.
Clarity is not the same as accuracy. And because we are living in a culture that feeds our impulses, that part of the brain, the ego brain, the primal brain, craves, certainty right now. And we forget to ask, okay, so I see what I see, or I sense what I sense, but is there more to it than that? Because to ask that actually requires us to slow down a little bit and to uh, partner our emotion with cognition, our feeling with thinking. And that takes time. And you know what? Most of us live today as if there is no time. But here's the weird thing. We've always only had 24 hours in a day. And as we're doom scrolling, wasting time, we're thinking, I have no time. I have no time. No, we have time. What we don't have is trust.
So if I tried to distill what you just said there, would you say that, and if I nerd it out for a second,
Yeah.
the epistemology behind this sort of mentality where your color, your race, what you look like, your phenotypical characteristics define your lived experience, you would argue, at least the way that you just described it, is a result of our desire to have certainty, a desire to rush to an answer or to an end. Is that accurate? Is that how you think about it?
It's how I've come to experience what others tell me
Okay.
about why they fall into the trap of confusing clarity with accuracy.
Right now, if you're, let's say, a student, oh, I don't know, let's pick a campus, Columbia. I wonder
Just
why we would
random,
talk
just
about
random.
Columbia.
I know.
I don't know, it's just random. Of the 2,000 institutions out there, that's the one that just came to mind. So right now, as we talk about this, we've got these sit-ins happening on Columbia's campus. You've got pro-Palestinian protesters sitting in. The campus police is being forced to clear the folks out. A lot of vitriol, a lot of anger. Could you apply that frame of thinking of this idea that we are rushing to clarity as opposed to accuracy
Mm,
as a way to potentially understand why a lot of folks feel so certain in their identity at this moment
Yeah.
that they feel that the only way to resolve the moment is through conflict and essentially almost a call to arms in some cases.
Yes, it's not even almost a call to arms. It is a call to arms in the sense that so much today, including the very dilemma ridden conflict that is Israel Palestine, is immediately framed as us against them.
Hmm.
And that framing,
Yes.
of course, feeds the ego brain's need for clarity, which again is not the same as accuracy.
And everyone who's them is one giant group. Everyone who's us is one giant group.
And by the way, it's not just angry activists who are framing it as us against them. It's also the people on the other side, whoever they may be, who feel fear as a result, who feel threatened that, let's say, because they, the them, are pro Palestine, them or they must be anti Israel. And sometimes they are, Manu. I'm not for a minute suggesting that everybody comes to this, to this scenario with a both and perspective. Of
Sure.
course,
Or a nuanced perspective. They might have
exactly,
certainty on one side.
exactly. But because of the fear and the threat that people on the other side feel when when they witness the anger of activists, they don't question whether it's possible that those people over there are more plural than I'm giving them credit for.
Hmm.
And so it becomes a monolith. The activists, again, whatever the issue,
Sure.
whatever the side, the activists become a monolith to the eyes of those on the other side, and those on the other side then become monolithic to the activists because everybody is operating from a place of threat.
Hmm.
And that comes directly out of the zero sum, not thinking, zero sum emoting that everybody is doing. And that is a crystal clear example of how we become the pawns of our own ego brains.
We become the pawns of our own ego brains. So, have you heard of the term outrage industrial complex by any chance? Have you heard that bandied around? So, one of the things that I've been wrestling with is the way that you describe this dynamic, right? Where it's like it's us versus them. It comes from a desire both to protect against a threat we feel and also a desire to just simplify the world, right? If it's my group, your group, well, you got to either take out one of the groups or you figure out how to work together. And I would assume that you're positing the latter. But it seems like people at this moment are disincentivized to elevate nuance and are incentivized to be outrageous. It seems like uh, every structural incentive points to the simplification of our binaries as opposed to complexifying them. Do you
Okay.
find that to be a reality? Or you
Well,
could complicate that assumption as well.
I actually do want to complicate what you just said. You use the word people. And again, I'm gonna paraphrase you here. People seem disincentivized, right? Okay, let's talk about who the people are.
Yes.
Because extremes, of course, have no interest in nuance. It's everybody in between who, you are right, feel like they can't be more nuanced because there is no permission structure for that. And this is why we have to be clear with anyone who cares to listen that when it comes to bridge building, it is not about demilitarizing the militants. Why would they buy into bridge building? That's not their MO. We've got to focus on all of those folks who feel like it's unsafe to pursue nuance. And that's why the work that people like you and me and the many, many others whom we consider our friends in the, in the whole network of depolarizers. That's why we can't get swept away by the oxygen sucking antics of many activists. We've got to keep our eyes on the ball that rolls forward. And these are the folks who whisper to themselves, I don't want to be that, but I don't know where else I can be.
Hmm.
These are the folks who need the support system of the work that we're doing.
The reason I can't stop myself from smiling is because that group of people sounds like the hopeful majority. The reason why the reason why we created the show and the title, right, was that in Irshad last year in February of 23, we hosted an annual summit with Bridge USA, right, where we got all these college students together. And all of them, to your point, have very strong beliefs, very strong ideas. Not a bunch of milk toasty people, right? It's like far left, far right, in the middle, blue, green, up, down, doesn't matter. And yet they all agreed on not what they believe, but they agreed on a temperament, a way of thinking, the how. And what I'm so incredibly curious about is how do you go about elevating the people like us? Because what I would assume is that people like us that want to have that nuanced conversation are also less likely to be loud and vocal. So, how do you go about building that permission structure so that folks feel like they actually have a voice in the current narrative, that they don't have to choose one extreme or the other in the way that they operate?
So, again, precisely because the world is complicated and more nuanced than we give it credit for, all of us, I don't presume to have a bullet point answer.
Darn.
Here's what I can't, right. Here's what I can tell you, though, Manu. When I'm engaging with students, I make it clear that if you want to be heard, you've got to make it safe for those who you want to give you a fair hearing. And so when you exercise the skills that we teach, it's not about being nice. Ugh. No one cares about nice, okay?
Holding hands.
No, not about hand holding harmony breaking out. It's not about rainbows and unicorns. It's not even about, and you can disagree with me here, I'd welcome that. It's not even about civility. Boy, do I hate that word.
I agree.
I really, really despise that word because that word is too often used as a way of suffocating important questions.
I'll be civil in my agreement of your critique of civility.
I accept your civility and still will invite disagreement further. Um, no, what this is about is becoming an effective communicator so that when you can leave your other feeling respected, and I want to define respected in just a second, but when you can leave your other feeling respected, not agreed with, but heard, you have worked with how we human beings are wired in allowing them to lower their emotional defenses so that they can expunge a lot of the clutter that is going on in their ego brains and free up their bandwidth to also give you the fair hearing that you have just offered them. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, I'd like to define respect. Respect comes from the Latin respectate. Spectate means to look. Re means again. Look again. So that any first impression that I get from you, Manu, whether again based on your labels or whether based on what I heard you say or the tone of what I heard you say, etc. If I'm going to respect you and in that way expect your reciprocity, I've got to say to myself, right now I'm just assuming about Manu. Instead of assuming, I've got to engage. I've got to find out more. And by the way, that doesn't mean that you won't still be the jerk that I think you are based on my assumption about you, right? It means that you might actually be more than what the first impression told me. And chances are you are more because here's the deal, I'm more than the impression that you got from me right away. And so respect requires engaging, moving beyond assumption. And that's when we can actually begin to appreciate one another as plurals, as more than meets the eye. It's the only label that I can stand by for any sentient being, uh, because in many ways it's an anti label. It elevates us to being multidimensional rather than reducing us to just a slice of whom we seem to be.
Well, thank you for letting me be more than just a jerk. If I translated that for a second, what I essentially hear you saying is you're giving people the chance to be better. And respect is not necessarily, I mean, I just learned something fascinating. Respectate. It's not just that we're politely engaging and sitting down and having dinner, and then if you say something that I'm like, that doesn't make sense. Well, all right, that means that we just have to paper past that because I have to be respectful. But in fact, what you're positing is that being respectful means engaging, stepping back into the ring,
Mhm.
and
Looking again,
looking again.
not allowing my first impression of you to be my only impression of you.
So I largely agree with your critique of the word civility. But what I'm about to say next is not actually, I think, against that. But
Mhm.
in a way, the way that you think about respect makes me think about civil disobedience, the tradition of civil disobedience, right? You're almost positing respectful engagement as a way to create change. Whereas I think when people just hear us talking about pluralism, which I don't even think half the people know what it actually means, or you're trying to think about how to have constructive conversations, most people think that we're trying to stand in their call for change. Whereas I think in some ways, you're saying that respectful conversation in some ways is a precondition actually to trying to build the world that you're trying to see. Is that a way to think about what you're saying?
That's very well said, Manu. So many people say to me, in order to move forward together, we need a shared story. But they assume that the shared story has to exist already. And because it doesn't, there's no way to move forward. And I say that's the purpose of engagement, co creating that shared story. It's not a precondition of engagement, it is the purpose of engagement. I want to say one other thing here. I can well imagine listeners thinking to themselves, well, all of this is well and good, but how in the hell are you going to get the conflict entrepreneurs of our world to buy in? And again, I want to emphasize, if you're fixated on the conflict entrepreneurs, you are missing the huge swath of people who are the real opportunity here,
100%.
right? And it's so easy for our thinking to be hijacked by the loudest, the noisiest, the most irritating people. Guess what? We again become their pawns when we become the pawns of our ego brains, right? So keep being intentional, keep uh, pulling yourself back to all of those people who are whispering rather than shouting. And ask yourself, if we can create a coalition of pluralists, not a tribe, a coalition of pluralists, of people who view one another as plurals, as multifaceted, as our first assumption about one another. If we can build a coalition of people like that, there is the permission structure, right? And that is the community that doesn't need then to turn to the extremists on either end as if somehow, in order to belong, we have to choose one or the other. No, we belong.
How does that coalition, Irshad, get seen when the people that are still the loudest are the conflict entrepreneurs? Like, how does the average everyday person that's sitting at home right now and they see the violence in our streets and they see the discord online and they're concerned and they're trying to find that coalition? How do they find them when everybody else is so loud?
Well, I think, Manu, this is where, again, people like you and me, and again, our many, many, many fellow
No,
travelers
it's just us. It's just us.
in the world, it's just you actually. But
Yeah,
many
yeah.
fellow travelers in the world of
See,
pluralism
the jerk in me's coming out. Sorry, keep going.
have to get a lot more clever than we are. I will let's get vulnerable with each other, shall we?
Absolutely. Please.
Okay. You know, when democracy advocates talk about democracy, I find that in so many cases, it's abstract. It's about institutions. It's about the concept. I- There is so little that people in this space do to make it utterly relatable to those who are, struggling on a day-to-day basis to figure out, where do I belong? We can't talk in abstracts and big ideas. We've got to have a sense of humor. We've got to poke fun at ourselves. We've got to invite people to tell us where we are going wrong, if only to model the very humility that we're asking of everybody else. We've got to outwit our own ego brains and get vulnerable with people whom we don't yet know. Yeah, we have a phrase at Moral Courage. We call it confident humility. Sounds like a contradiction, but all it is a delicious paradox. Confident humility means the self assurance, the belief that my experiences are valid, and therefore I don't need to be threatened by other people's experiences. The self assurance to accept that there's so much more to learn. And so let's get curious. What is it that I'm missing? Help me understand what I might be missing about you. Um, I even say that, by the way, to people who despise what I stand for. And funnily enough, not always, but more often than we might assume, they stop in their tracks because this is the first time that they've been shown respect from someone who disagrees with their tactics.
Let me just ask you something right there, Irshad. In the spirit of vulnerability, what do you
Yeah.
think people that despise what you stand for get wrong about you?
So there's a lot because I have a history. You know, 20 years ago, I wrote a book called The Trouble with Islam Today, provocative title. And some people remember that and assume that I am there to tell them that, their religion is wrong, or I'm there to pick a fight because they've heard a little bit about this book and she must be a provocateur. And again, what I remind folks is that, if we're actually living, which means learning, um, we're all works in progress. And we should give each other the opportunity to grow. And so I am hoping that I will grow from what it is that you share with me. Because again, for as much as you're getting something wrong about me, I may be getting something wrong about you. And others, by the way, I'm not for a moment saying that, everybody cares to help me grow. Some people are like, F you. I don't have time for this shit. Right. And that's okay too, because the fact that I haven't pushed them with taunts of, oh, well, if that's your response, then, I must be pretty threatening to you. No, if leave it. Let them think about what just happened. And that again, Manu, is part of why we need to be modeling the very skills that we are teaching. I don't come to this work believing that I'm 100% right. I know I'm not. How can I be? I'm human. And so I just want to learn. And for those who are willing to set me straight, to put me in my place,
Engage, respectfully engage. I mean, that the way that you asserted that is essentially what I would imagine is confident humility in a nutshell. You confidently asserted the fact that you're willing to have your mind and your opinions and your ideas challenged. And I'm wondering, just on a human note, do you think that that requires a certain sense of security about yourself to be able to be willing
yes,
to be corrected in
yes,
a public manner?
that's absolutely right, as far as I can tell. And that's why confident humility starts with the phrase self assurance.
Right.
Okay. The self assurance to accept that there's always more to learn. What I mean is that we've got, as individuals, to be okay with what we have experienced in our own journeys, in our own backstories. And if we can tell ourselves what you experienced, Irshad or Manu, is valid. It's not everybody's experience, but that doesn't make it invalid. It's valid. Trust it. So trust you. And when we can have or build that kind of self assurance, because again, it isn't given to us, we've got to build it in ourselves. If we can build that kind of self assurance, then what that means is when I hear a point of view dramatically different from our own, or my own, I should say, and when I can understand the experiences that lead to that point of view, I don't have to feel threatened. Why? Because it isn't that somebody is trying to tell me that my experience is invalid. It's that they're sharing their own story, right? So it means depolarizing ourselves first and foremost.
How do you respond to the critique that confident humility and the ability to depolarize yourself is something that only people of privilege can access?
Listen, um, I uh, I reject that, um, while still acknowledging I may be wrong to reject that, and I reject that because so much polarization is built on the back of adversity. For example, I grew up in a very violent household, and it would have been easy for me to decide that all men are violent. And I went through that phase, and I was wrong. I was wrong to fall into the either or trap. I will tell you, I've had male role models who, to this day, since my teenage years, I am still in touch with. That adversity has been the source of perspective. And so the privilege that I've had precisely comes from the adversity that I faced. And I don't see privilege, by the way, as some kind of a finger waggy concept. I see it as a blessing. And exactly because it is a blessing, the ability to be thinking about this and growing from it, I can't just be complacent about the blessing. I like to share how other people might see their, setbacks as blessings that build in them not just resilience, not just anti-fragility, but originality.
You know what I really appreciate about what you just said is you outlined a position of marginalization when you were a child and when you were younger, and you talk about the difficulty of your home, and you turn that into a way to actually access privilege, which is fascinating because I think we live at this moment where we assume that folks that start at different levels, different parts of the playing field, have different adverse experiences, can never actually access privilege. But in a way, what I appreciate about what you're saying is that everybody actually, in a way, can turn their adversity into the opportunity to be more effective, more engaged, to have the perspective.
And I'll add one other thing here, which is that, let's go back to October 7th.
Yeah,
Uh, you know, I have spoken since then with many Palestinian friends who, they're not in a position to have deep conversations about these things right now,
of course.
but many have shared with me that when they're presumed to be only victims, that's the real rub. That hurts more than than the assumption that there would be terrorists.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so it goes back to the point that uh, we are all so much more than what we assume about one another. Sometimes we are victims of our circumstances, but it doesn't mean that we stay that way or have to stay that way.
Or defined by it.
Precisely. Uh, it's not unlike, here we go, power. Power is not static, it's situational. And uh, Manu, I am sure, I'll speak for myself, but you tell me if this rings true for you. There are times when, as a brown skinned person, I actually have more power
Absolutely.
than the white folks around me.
Have you ever been to my Indian wedding? You know? Absolutely. Are you kidding?
Right. And beyond even the Indian parties.
If my white roommate went to my village in India, that guy would be the bottom of the bottom rung.
So, it's like even here in America or here in the West, there are times when people who look like you and me will not be questioned. But white folks, if they say something similar to what you and I can get away with saying, not only will they be questioned, they'll be ostracized.
Right.
So it's all about recognizing, right? That as Bruce Lee taught, we got to be like water. Water always gets to where it needs to go, even in the midst of rocks. And it gets to where it needs to go not merely by crashing up against the rocks. When it only crashes up, it blows back. Water, to its credit, has a larger toolkit than confrontation. Water washes over, it glides around, it seeps through. And given that we are 80% water, we will be a hell of a lot healthier if we became more like water.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you might be 80% water. I've got about a solid 20% coffee in me right now. as we've been as we've been on the road. I
Is
have
it
caffeinated.
coffee with a lot of cream? In other words, is it cream with coffee?
That's a well, no, it's see, this is where I've broken with my Indian family members. Is
Ah,
it's as black as the coffee gets, but
wow.
it's got water in it. It's heavily watered. But I will say I can already hear somebody listening to this, and here's what I appreciate about our audience and the folks that are engaged is that there's never an episode where somebody does not find something that they disagree with, and that's actually exactly the point. And I can already hear someone saying, "Well, Irshad just make the claim that." you know, white folks also experience oppression in certain circumstances. What is she trying to say? And what I actually interpret to what you're getting at is not trying to get into a discussion or debate about what groups hold the most privilege or power
Mhm.
historically, because I think there's honestly, you ask the left to right, if you ask a normal person on the street, people largely understand the point that I think a lot of proponents of the DEI work are making, which is like, yes, some people have been more historically advantaged. The question becomes, what do you do with that? And I think what you're positing, and I want you to tell me if I'm interpreting it correctly or not, or confront the critic in the audience. But what I hear you saying is that your position and power, the starting point, does not have to define where you end up. And in fact, you're trying to give people a sense of empowerment that, look, you're an Indian person, you're an African American person, you're a member of the LGBTQ community, you're a white person, whatever you might be, it oscillates over time. And so the question becomes, what do we do about it? And how do we improve our own individual lives? Is that essentially what you're trying to convey? And feel free to disagree if not.
No, 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 I'm there, I'm thinking it through, and I would say all of what you've just summarized, is accurate as far as I'm concerned, accurate to what I mean to convey. And I want to go a step further. When you say, like, how do we apply this to our own individual lives? It is not selfish to be asking how we apply this to our own individual lives. Quite the opposite. Because if we recognize that we are, in fact, interdependent, meaning that systems are not monolithic structures, they are webs of relationships. So that if I can heal myself, I am contributing to the healing of the very relationships that I'm a part of. And in so doing, helping to heal, or at the very least, giving permission to others in relationship with me to heal as well. When I say heal, let me be very clear. I mentioned a few moments ago that about 20 years ago, I wrote a book called The Trouble with Islam Today. And because I knew that I would be on the receiving end of a lot of hostility, I listened to that voice. I thought it was the voice of conscience, but actually it was the voice of ego. I listened to that voice that said, Irshad, you know that you're going to be reamed out for this. So when you are punched, verbally or otherwise, be sure to counterpunch. Show them you mean business. Show them you're not going to be intimidated. And so, Manu, I would do that over and over and over again, turning what might have been healthy discussions into us against them debates. And over time, it's not just my detractors who began to dig in their heels. Also, my supporters began to view me with suspicion. Is she in this to move the needle, or is she in this to play gotcha? And ultimately, my body rebelled, fell into a deep clinical depression, began having panic attacks, and ultimately had a seizure at the most inopportune time because my body couldn't take it anymore. And when I say it, what is it that I couldn't take? The feeding of toxic energy and the ingesting of toxic energy. And I had to make a choice. Do I need to give up my convictions in order to function with mental health? Or do I stick with what I believe and figure out how to move forward? And the answer for me was I didn't have to dilute my convictions at all. I only had to change how I communicate those convictions. If I could communicate them in a way that was healthy for me, that allowed me to heal, that allowed me not to be bifurcated by binary, assumptions, then I would also be giving my so-called other the opportunity to heal, not being sort of uh, by not being uh, reactive, by not having to be reactive to me, by allowing them to be responsive rather than reactive. Today, 20 years later, I am happier because I'm healthier than I've ever been. And all of that is to say, you don't have to compromise what you believe in order to be pluralistic. You get to, stand your ground. It's just that at the same time, you're creating, not seeking, not finding, but proactively creating common ground. Standing your ground is about what you believe. Creating common ground is about how you express what you believe.
And what's so powerful right there is that the creation of common ground is not compromise, but it's actually just a good practice to be a healthy human being. It's actually just positive energy.
It's a great practice to be a healthy human being, knowing that you are part of a system, webs of relationships, in which your health will also either get in the way of or help amplify the health of others. I want to finish that story about, my time as a Muslim reform activist.
Before you finish that story, I just want to just emphasize one thing there, and then I want you to not have to respond to what I'm saying, but I want you to finish the story. But there's one thing I want to catch on, which is that you described how you started off as in some ways a conflict entrepreneur potentially,
Yes.
right? Or
Yeah,
that's what
not
most view
potentially.
you as.
Yes, I was.
And you acknowledge that and you're operating and operated to change the way that you operated.
Mhm.
That's a lot of operating. And like that is inspirational as a young person. Because I there are not that many role models out there right now in the world that are willing to acknowledge where they went wrong and are willing to change. And it's in fact, you actually come out on top. This is not like a point of defeat that you change. It's actually a point of victory. So I just wanted to emphasize that I really appreciated you sharing that.
Well, I thank you very much, and I want to just springboard off of something you said a couple seconds ago. There is no defeat here. This is a beautiful segue into how I want to put the finishing
Sure.
flourish on this story. After I had my seizure, um, and I had to make a choice about how I was going to move forward, um, I got an invitation from Al Jazeera inviting me to debate whether Islam really does need reform. And I, of course, thought, well, debate is what got me into this mess in the first place. So I accepted. I accepted not because I couldn't help myself, but because I needed to test myself, Manu. I was so good at turning discussion into debate. Could I do the opposite? Turn debate into discussion? And I prepared for this so called debate by making several emotional agreements with myself. Irshad, remember that the guy on the other side is your adversary, he's not your enemy. When he makes a good point, and he will, acknowledge it as a good point. There is zero shame in recognizing that, smart people beyond you are in this room. When you are asked a question that you have no ready answer for, don't BS your way through it. People know when they're being played. No, take a breath, pause, process it. And if you still don't come up with an answer that you can readily stand by, ask the person who's posed the question to you, how would you have me think about this? I'd love to learn from you. And I did all of those things during the debate. Afterwards, a group of imams, Muslim ministers, followed me upstairs to the reception. And they approached me and said, "This is not the Irshad Manji we're used to." They said, "You had humility this evening. And so we know we're not going to be feeding your ego when we confide to you that we support a lot of what you're advocating. Manu, I had been waiting a decade to hear something like this. And it was only when I led by listening that I realized there is power in giving space to contrary views. What I learned that night is that listening doesn't have to translate into losing. And so much is this the case that a couple of months later, just a cohort within that group of imams reached out to me to say, could you coach us on how to bring this message of reform to our own very traditional congregations? Now, that I would have never bargained for, to actually be coaching, mentoring imams. What they saw in me as humility then was reciprocated by them. We're not in a place today where we can hear one another right away. But we are in a place where one of us can create the culture of the conversation, can set the bar for what is possible. And even if in the same conversation, you don't get the reciprocity that you were hoping for, keep the door open, because we are all works in progress, and all of us need time to ingest new experiences, including experiences that we have at the hands of our other. And that again brings us back to the time trust equation. We think we're in a crisis of time, as if we don't have enough of it. It's the exact opposite. We've got time. We've got the time to slow down and be intentional and be good to our own health. What we don't have, but can build when we slow down, is trust. Most people, Manu, don't realize that we, the people, we agree far more on a lot of the issues that we're told are polarizing than we believe we do. We're much less divided about major issues than we are about something else, and that's each other. So the challenge, yes, but also the opportunity now is to become worthy of each other's trust. And if I wait for the other to become worthy of my trust, I'll be waiting forever. You know why? Because my other doesn't trust that I'm going to meet them in good faith. So don't wait. Don't wait for the other. Be good to your health. You start on the trust building front and give it the time to unfold in the way that it needs to.
Holy shit, that was good. I have to be honest with you. I mean, I think um we've had Irshad. Lots of people come through here. You know, a lot of presidential people, a lot of academics, a lot of intellectuals. But I think what I really appreciated about the last 6 minutes was that I think you left people with a lot of insight into how they can actually approach this in their daily lives. The story that you described about the imams taking you upstairs and that you actually achieved your outcome that you probably intended to write through the book was actually achieved by leading through listening as opposed to leading through fighting. I think is right on. And so I've got nothing else to add other than welcome to the hopeful majority.
I love, by the way, that you emphasize hopeful. This is different than being optimistic.
Yes, absolutely. There's a distinction.
And I will tell you, and I'd love to hear how you feel about this, whether you would describe yourself in the same way. I'm not optimistic. I'm I don't believe it'll all be okay, but I do believe we have the capacity to move in the right direction. And that's where my hope comes from.
I think that, and by the way, for those of you that can watch on YouTube, I am not texting because I don't find what Irshad is saying is fascinating. In fact, I find it so fascinating that I'm telling my next call to stay. Hold on for a sec. We got to finish this conversation.
Are we overtime? I didn't realize that. I'm sorry. That's how into the conversation I am.
And me too. It happens. It happens all the time on this show. I think here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna create a part. Once your travels reduce a little less, we're gonna do a part two actually, if you're open to it. Because I think the audience, the young people, the students, everybody, I think there's a lot of nuggets to learn here, and I actually think your point about hope versus optimism is a really, really good place to pick up. And the reason is because everybody comes up to me and they say like, the hopeful majority. Well, that sounds cliche. And they say that, well, there must be some Pollyannish feeling about just being hopeful. But to your point, the distinction between hope and optimism is hope assumes that you can create an input that leads to an action, whereas optimism is just this blind belief that it's all just going to work out.
Mhm.
And I think, like, look, the controversy that you described, that people, that your detractors referred to, I was like 5 years old during, and so I have no idea. I could care less.
Right. Right.
But what I'm listening to right now, I think we need more of that dialogue, more of that engagement. I could not be more grateful to you for making the time today. I know that's the one day that you're not traveling, and very rarely am I left with more thoughts and curiosities doing conversations. So thank you.
It's my pleasure, Manu. And when we have a bit more time, uh, in early May, actually, I should have a bit more time. Let's also discuss what, if anything, can be done with the student conference in July. Okay.
For the audience that doesn't know what Irshad is mentioning, Bridge USA hosts an annual student summit where we bring together all these not optimistic but hopeful young people from across the political spectrum that want to change the way that the world looks today and want to push these norms forward. And so, absolutely, we'll do that. Thank you, Irshad, for coming on.
Peace out, my brother.
Thank you so much to Earshot for coming on, and I hope you saw why I wanted all of us to listen to that entire conversation. Man, did I learn a lot. And the way that that conversation ended, it left me speechless. In fact, my reaction was, holy shit, that was good. And I think you probably agree. And importantly, there's parts that you probably disagreed with. And that's the entire point of the show. That's the entire point of the political moment we're in. How do we have productive disagreements? This work is not about watering down our passion for beliefs, but stepping up and engaging in a productive way where we see each other's common humanity to build a better tomorrow. And speaking of tomorrow, I'll see you next Monday, YouTube, Spotify, Apple. It's because you and I are together building this hopeful majority that we can actually elevate the majority of us that want to have those conversations. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you're on Spotify and Apple, leave a review. We're growing and building this thing together. I'll see you next week.